a great pleasure to ask Iseult White to kick off this evening. Just a little introduction for Iseult. She's an independent director, executive coach, management consultant, and psychotherapist. Her letter to the Irish Times about amnesty and freedom of conscience defends, quote, legitimate representation to people of conscience. Iseult, we're really glad to have you here this evening. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here, delighted to talk about the fact that women's rights are human rights and about the problems of attempting to hold NGOs to account, and particularly the problems of attempting to hold a global human rights organization to account, such as Amnesty. I just wanted to say, as I kick off, that I'm wearing some homicidal haberdashery tonight in sisterhood with Marion, whose human rights are being attacked in Scotland, along with many of our sisters in Scotland. In framing this in the 15 minutes and to create space for conversation, I thought I would just try and explain how I attempted to hold Amnesty to account and why I attempted to hold them to account. And in doing that, I also used personal experience I had had previously of holding an NGO to account in my own life, when I discovered it's really difficult to hold NGOs to account, and also from my own involvement in NGOs at board level. So really just a sort of a general understanding of NGOs. So in fact, the reason that I had even a slight chance of holding Amnesty to account when they sent a letter, or when they promoted a letter in Ireland last November that demanded the removal of legitimate representation in the media and in government. So when they published that letter, I responded to it, and just really through an accident of birth, I was in a unique position to attempt to hold them to account. So just to quickly explain that, my grandfather, Sean McBride, was co-founder of Amnesty and chairman of Amnesty up until 1975. So Amnesty were just part of my life growing up. We, a lot of the things were run from my grandparents' house. We used to send the Christmas cards. Amnesty was really important to my grandfather. It was sort of the culmination of his life's work, really. And the heritage he had came from his mother, Maud Gaughan McBride, who had first started fighting for political prisoners back in 1890, when an Irishman, Michael Davitt, was held in Portland Prison in the UK. And she herself was later arrested and held in Holloway Prison. And then finally in the Irish Free State, she was also held for peaceful protest in the Irish Free State. So my family had a really strong understanding of the need for protecting prisoners of conscience. And when Amnesty was started, it had a very tight remit, which was to work for the rights of prisoners of conscience, people who had been imprisoned, tortured, or executed because their opinions or their religion were unacceptable to their government. And it didn't matter, it wasn't about judging their opinions or their religion. It was only that they shouldn't be punished because their opinions were held from a place of conscience. And using that model, which was a very tight remit, Amnesty was able to very successfully build a global human rights brand. But as other human rights brands sort of came in and they were no longer the lone gatekeeper, and also as their membership expanded, there was demands for them to sort of shore up their legitimacy by adopting an increasing number and widening range of rights issues, civil society issues. So reproductive rights, that they famously took some time but decided to campaign for the rights of sex workers as workers, and now also for transgender identity, for gender identity rights. And this has created some problems for them as a human rights organization, and that was seen very clearly at the time of Navalny, because originally they adopted him as a prisoner of conscience, but then under a concerted propaganda campaign by the Russian government, they de-adopted him. I don't know what the opposite of adopt is, but they de-adopted him because apparently he had said hate speech, and they can no longer just adopt people on conscience. You have to fit in with this broad range of their so-called human rights campaigns. They have since again adopted him. So they're confused as an organization, I think is the best we could say. So what happened last November was that the Transgender Equality Network of Ireland published a letter, and Amnesty International signed and promoted it along with 27 other NGOs, and that will be put up on the chat if you want a link to look at it. And I don't want to spend too much time on it, people can go and read it later. But the key things to understand about the letter is a 3-page letter, kind of poorly written, I would say, personally, and it kind of used the techniques of authoritarian propaganda. So it defined a threat from the outside that was attacking this very beleaguered community, the transgender community. And that threat came from a variety of people who were bigots. They were individuals, new grassroots organizations, outsiders, and foreigners. But a key part of the letter was that it named none of these things. So we had to rely on all of these organizations and Amnesty to believe that these people existed and that they would name them as they came up, I suppose. So we had no way of going and checking what they were talking about. And then finally, they made a demand for censorship. And so the key message was, we call on media and politicians to no longer provide legitimate representation for those that share bigoted beliefs that are aligned with far-right ideologies. No mention of what the supposed far-right ideologies, so it took some time to understand the letter. I read it about 10 times in dismay because of how illiberal and anti-democratic it was. But I finally discovered the sentence in there that let me know what a far-right ideology was, and that was that sex is a spectrum. Sex and gender are both spectrums. So wherever you stand within in this whole issue, it is very controversial to suggest that saying that biological sex is binary and material and immutable, that's not a far-right ideology. I mean, that's just like a really ridiculous statement. And, you know, my response to the letter fundamentally came from the attack on human rights. Because in this letter, there was basically 3 sets of human rights that were being absolutely attacked. Freedom of expression, freedom of association. There was an attempt to prevent, you know, to demand that government not allow grassroots organizations get going. And there was an attack on basic political representation. And on every level, as a member of a democracy, those things are just completely abhorrent to me. And it actually wouldn't matter who was being defended in that way. I would still want to fight this letter. Now, like I say, I was lucky in attempting to do that because I had this position through this birthright that gave me some currency in attacking the letter, so to speak. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, how do you start to think about even holding NGOs to account? And my answer in response would be, it is extremely, extremely difficult to do. For a number of reasons. One is the relationship between NGOs and the public. So as members of the public, we tend to want to do good things in society, but a lot of us are busy and we don't necessarily have a lot of time. So we kind of hand over the responsibility for doing good in society to NGOs. And then NGOs like to in turn sort of court us because we're part of their fundraising. And it takes a really gross breach of trust by an NGO for the public to really respond. And even then, you know, within a year or two, many of them will recover. So it's really, really difficult. Then the other issue is for national NGOs, as opposed to transnational NGOs. There's a symbiotic relationship between the NGOs and government, where the NGOs tend to provide sort of cheap service delivery, and in turn, government depends on them. So the government is invested in the NGOs are invested in government, and NGOs aren't able to be fully independent critics. And those organizations that signed the Amnesty letter are all grouped together, they campaign together, they walk in lockstep, and government is happy to deal with them because it just gives them a small number of people to deal with. So when you try to hold an NGO to account, you are against the NGO, the public, and the government. So it's never going to be an easy situation. So in thinking about holding an NGO to account, I suppose the first thing you have to do is look for a chink in that armor. And the ways to think about that is, have they departed from their stated purpose? But that really only works if they're regulated. So for instance, Amnesty, being transnational, is not subject to any regulations nationally in Ireland. It's a private company, essentially. I suppose the other thing you could do is, if they've done something illegal, particularly something fiduciary, you can always hold them to account. Or if they've done something that puts them in conflict with a major funding source. So either it's a branding headache, or in some way they don't fulfill an SLA they have with a funder. But one thing I think that, you know, always have to consider when you're trying to hold an NGO to account, that it should never be perceived as an attack on the beneficiaries of the NGO. And you want to take a very strategic, analytic, methodical kind of process in thinking about it. So when I looked at the Amnesty situation, I realized I had an opportunity to hold them to account on some level because of my background, and because they had moved away from fundamental human rights issues that most Amnesty members are concerned about. So I attacked them on the freedom of expression, particularly the freedom of expression, and I started using the chilling effect hashtag. One thing to understand, that when you try to hold an NGO to account, they will probably attack you with everything they have. So you really want to prepare yourself emotionally and mentally for that, and really look after your own public image and be prepared to fight back hard. And I think a really good example of that is the way Stonewall attacked Alison. NGOs will happily scapegoat and victimize anybody who gets in their way. And it's not necessarily the individuals in the NGO, it's the NGO as a systemic entity. Thankfully, Alison is successfully fighting back, but not everybody ends up having the wherewithal to do that. So I think it's really, really important when you consider if you are going to attack an NGO, that you remember not to attack the demographic they're supporting. So, I mean, I wouldn't attack transgender people anyway. They have been part of my community, but the fact that I was able to shift the dialogue, completely pivoted from transgender issues just onto freedom of expression issues, meant that many people in Ireland who would never have spoken up or got involved if it was about transgender rights actually were interested, read the stuff, and some got involved. And so there was a variety of people who stood up with me and said what Amnesty was doing was wrong. And that did create some amount of a branding issue for Amnesty. And so they came back and attacked us really quite strongly, and accused me of misrepresentation and attacking their human rights campaigns and all sorts of stuff. But anyway, I was successful in significantly drawing attention to an issue with them. The next thing, I suppose, is to look at what can you actually do then? And, you know, people were asking me, have they got in touch with you? No, of course they wouldn't get in touch with me. You know, can you form a complaint? It's very difficult to form a complaint against an organization like Amnesty, because, like I say, you've nothing to hold them account to. I have formed a complaint. I have sent it in formally to the board of Amnesty Ireland. I'm still awaiting a response from them. And I suppose you think about those things strategically. No matter what the response is, I can still use the complaint to go further. And that's all just something that will go on slowly in the background. I think in general, you know, mostly we're trying to hold more national NGOs to account. And I think Stonewall, what's happened with Stonewall is a really brilliant example of that. And what's made it possible to hold Stonewall to account is they've essentially been breaking the law, right? Their guidance is not fit for purpose with the law. So that gives a real angle for going in and attacking. But as we've all seen, that has been incredibly slow process, difficult to gain traction. again, that's because the public like their NGOs. You know, they don't really want to attack an NGO. So you're always up against that. And I think in the Stonewall situation in the UK, it's probably lucky that Conservatives are in government, because I don't think Labour would have taken the position that Liz Truss has taken. And I suppose then you use all the other tools that are available to you. So when it's a national NGO that works with government, you use FOIs, you track down funding, you track down breaches of SLAs, and you try and work on all of those things. And I think this campaign with Stonewall is how we need to be thinking about holding NGOs to account. And I think NGOs are sort of past their sell-by date in many ways. You know, they're very corporatized. It's this constant issue around how they're very focused on getting their next piece of funding, rather than maybe thinking on a principled level about the people they're representing. And I think there are real models emerging now of like what's happened in the UK, of new loosely distributed networks of people doing specific fundraising for specific targets that they can campaign on, and really paying attention to where there is a strong energy, a focus, and some kind of natural momentum. And I think that holding NGOs to account, it really involves both creating new grassroots organizations like Women's Place, like LGB Alliance, and also finding targets that can be campaigned on. So will I be successful in holding Amnesty to account as a global human rights organization? No. So the other thing you need to do is just think really strategically about what you're trying to do. So I've been able to use that very successfully as a tool to educate people in Ireland, to open a bit of a space or a wedge that other people can start talking about the issues, and to draw attention to this constant narrowing of acceptable speech. And there are still many people our age, my age, in the world who care about freedom of expression, even though that's not something that tends to be something that younger people care significantly about. But I think it's about also thinking that everything you do is an opportunity to do something. So every time you speak up, it's an opportunity to make a point, to provide information, to provide links to things that people who lurk on Twitter and other places like that see. And you find that in doing so, it's much easier than you think to speak up. It's worth doing. And people support you in ways that are oblique. They don't necessarily come out and say, "Way, go Iseult, look at what you're doing," because nobody in Ireland has really done that, apart from some women. But not the establishment at all. And the Irish Times, they took about 3 days to decide to publish my letter, and they had no excuse not to publish it, because it was so clear and carefully worded that there was no reason on this earth that they shouldn't publish it. But they sat on it for 3 full days before they published it, thinking about it. And so that's really it. Just keep speaking up and think about what you want to say and how you want to do it. So thank you.